Picture this. A poor, basically uneducated house painter from Vermont,
Right.
who eventually marries 56 women and builds this massive multi-million-dollar empire out in the desert.
Yeah, it's wild.
But here is the hook. When he was first told about the doctrine of polygamy, his immediate reaction was that it was the first time in his entire life he, quote, desired the grave.
I mean, it is just an incredible contradiction right out of the gate.
Totally.
You have a guy who spent his early years, making chairs and fitting glass into windows in upstate New York. He is far removed from any halls of power or, formal education.
Yeah.
And he ends up becoming known as the American Moses, acting as the unquestioned sovereign over this massive stretch of the American West.
So for you listening, here is what we are doing today. We are examining a stack of historical and biographical sources to profile the life of Brigham Young.
You?
Our mission on this deep dive is to understand how this obscure craftsman became the theocratic ruler of a frontier empire.
It's quite the journey.
It really is. We're going to unpack his undeniable achievements, his staggering contradictions, and, well, the dark controversies that still echo today.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to me, this story is like a completely unknown middle manager taking over a bankrupt, heavily persecuted startup right after the charismatic founder's sudden assassination.
That is a really good way to put it.
And then, through sheer force of will, turning it into a multinational monopoly, but doing so completely outside the bounds of normal American society.
That's the perfect framework for this. Because to understand the empire builder, we first have to examine the man looking for a purpose.
Right.
We have to strip away the legacy and look at the humble, highly practical realities of his early life.
So where does he start?
Well, he was born in 1801 in Vermont and raised in upstate New York. He received virtually no formal education.
None at all.
Barely any. His mother taught him how to read and write, but she died of tuberculosis when he was just 14.
Oh, wow. Right, and after that, he's essentially sent out into the world to learn a trade.
Exactly.
He becomes a carpenter, a painter, and a glazier, which means he's the guy cutting and fitting glass into windows.
Working with his hands.
Yeah, he is measuring things, solving very physical, practical problems day in and day out. And he's raised with strict Puritan values.
Very strict. But he also had this fascinating streak of, fierce independence.
How so?
Well, for instance, he used tobacco, but he completely refused to drink alcohol.
Okay.
However, when the local temperance movement asked him to officially sign a pledge stating he wouldn't drink, he flat out refused.
Wait, really? Even though he didn't drink anyway?
Yep. His reasoning was, and this is a quote, "I wish to do just right without being bound to do it. I want my liberty."
That one detail says so much about his psychology.
Totally.
He's saying, I won't drink, but don't you dare try to put it in writing and control me.
Exactly. He wanted to be the one calling the shots.
He was also a serious religious seeker, right?
Yeah.
By the late 1820s, he was looking for a church, but remained unconvinced that any existing denomination held the true authority of Jesus Christ.
Right. Then, in 1830, his brother gives him a copy of this newly published text, the Book of Mormon.
And importantly, he doesn't just instantly convert.
He doesn't.
No, he takes his time. He studies it for 2 whole years. The real turning point comes in 1832.
What happened then?
Missionaries from the early Latter-day Saint movement come to his town, and what really hooks him is their practice of what they called spiritual gifts.
Like what kind of gifts?
He witnesses these missionaries speaking in tongues and prophesying. It was this raw, ecstatic religious experience.
Wow.
He is baptized in April 1832, and shortly after, he himself speaks in tongues.
No way.
Yeah. And later that year, he travels to Ohio to meet the church's founder, Joseph Smith. During that visit, Brigham Young speaks in a tongue that Smith identifies as the Adamic language.
The Adamic language.
Yeah, which in their theology was the original pure language spoken by Adam in the Garden of Eden.
Okay, I have to stop you there because this is the central tension for me.
How does a highly practical, hands-on carpenter a guy whose literal day job is measuring wood and cutting glass to exact specifications, reconcile with mystical experiences like channeling the ancient language of Adam?
It is a huge leap.
It seems like a massive leap. Is this tension between the deeply pragmatic and the deeply mystical the defining trait of his entire life?
I think you've hit on the exact mechanism that made him such a formidable historical figure. What's fascinating here is that he didn't see a contradiction between the two.
Really?
Not at all. For him, the mystical experiences like speaking in tongues provided an absolute unshakable certainty. It proved to him that God was real and active.
Okay.
Once he had that spiritual anchor, he didn't float away into mysticism. Instead, he deployed all of his ruthless, practical, administrative skills to serve it.
Oh, I see.
He didn't just want to feel the spirit, he wanted to organize it, structure it, and build a physical kingdom for it.
And that intense spiritual loyalty to Joseph Smith is exactly what positioned Young to step into a massive power vacuum when tragedy struck the early church.
Yes, absolutely.
By 1835, Young had risen to a governing body called the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He was organizing missions, managing logistics, overseeing the church's early exodus to Illinois.
He was the logistics guy.
He's essentially acting as the chief operating officer to Joseph Smith's visionary CEO.
Precisely. And the Quorum of the 12 was originally designed as a traveling council to manage affairs outside the main body of the church.
Right.
But Young's administrative competence made them increasingly central. Then, in June 1844, the unthinkable happens.
The assassination.
Yeah. While Brigham Young is away on the East Coast campaigning for Joseph Smith's long-shot run for U.S. president, Smith is assassinated by an armed mob in a jail in Carthage, Illinois.
The founder is dead. The charismatic visionary is gone.
Gone.
And because Smith didn't leave an entirely undisputed succession plan, the church is thrown into a massive crisis.
It was total chaos. You had thousands of followers suddenly adrift, and multiple claimants stepping up to fill the void.
Like who?
Well, the most prominent showdown happens a few weeks later, on August 8, 1844, in Nauvoo, Illinois. On one side, you have Sid G. Rigdon.
Okay.
He was the senior surviving member of the First Presidency, which was the highest governing body. Rigdon essentially argues that no one can truly replace Joseph Smith, so he should be appointed guardian or spokesman to lead the church.
And on the other side is Brigham Young.
Exactly.
He steps up and argues that the church doesn't need a temporary spokesman. He asserts that the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, as a collective body, holds the true priesthood authority to lead the church forward.
And this meeting is where the famous mythos of the Transfiguration is born.
Right, the Transfiguration.
According to the journals and reminiscences of many followers who were in the crowd that day, when Brigham Young spoke to the congregation, a miracle occurred.
They claimed he suddenly looked and sounded exactly like the martyred Joseph Smith.
Yes, they attributed it to the power of God, providing a divine confirmation of his right to lead.
Okay, I have to push back a little here.
Go for it.
Because my skeptical alarm bells are ringing loudly. Isn't it incredibly convenient that he transformed into the beloved founder right at the exact moment people were voting on who should be in charge?
It is very convenient timing.
To an outsider, it sounds a lot like collective grief manifesting a miracle to give a traumatized community the certainty they desperately needed.
That is a very valid pushback, and historians absolutely debate the mechanics of what happened that day.
What do the sources actually say?
If we look closely at the primary sources, scholars point out that there isn't a lot of contemporary evidence, meaning diary entries written on the actual day of the speech, detailing a literal physical metamorphosis.
Oh, interesting.
In fact, some of the earliest comprehensive accounts describing this mantle of Joseph falling upon Brigham were written years later, around 1850.
Wait, really?
Yeah. And interestingly, they were often written not by male priesthood leaders trying to consolidate power, but by women in the church's laity, like Caroline Barnes Crosby and Emily Smith Hoyt.
So it might have been a trick of collective memory, like retroactively applying a miraculous explanation to the moment they finally felt secure again.
Exactly. Regardless of whether it was a miraculous event, a masterful psychological performance by Young mimicking Smith's cadence, or a retroactive memory shaped by grief, the result was the same.
He won the vote.
The majority voted to sustain the Quorum of the 12, effectively cementing Brigham Young as the new absolute leader.
So having secured that leadership, Young faces what has to be the ultimate logistical nightmare.
Oh yeah, nightmares putting it lightly.
The church is still facing intense mob violence in Illinois. They're being burned out of their homes. He has to move thousands of heavily persecuted people across an untamed continent to a place where no one else wants to live.
Right.
This is the feat that earns him that American Moses moniker.
It was an incredible, almost impossible undertaking. In 1846, to avoid federal troops and local militias, he orchestrated the exodus out of Nauvoo.
But he didn't just tell people to walk west.
No. He organized the trek meticulously. He broke them into companies of hundreds, 50s, and 10s. He established way stations, had advanced teams plant crops for the trailing groups to harvest,
Wow.
and finally arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, which was then technically part of Mexico, on July 24th, 1847.
So he steps out of a wagon into this harsh, arid valley, recovering from mountain fever,
Oh.
looks out and supposedly says, "This is the right place."
Yep.
And he doesn't miss a beat. Within days, he designates the exact center spot for a temple and starts organizing what will become Salt Lake City.
It was immediate.
He dictates that the city be laid out in massive 10-acre blocks with wide streets.
Yes, and that urban planning was just the beginning of his empire. After the Mexican-American War, the region becomes a U.S. territory.
Right.
In 1851, President Millard Fillmore appoints Young as the first governor of the Utah Territory.
Right.
Over his 30 years of leadership, Young directed the founding of 350 towns across the West. 350 towns. He essentially colonized the vast, dry expanse between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada by sending out specialized groups of settlers.
Like who?
Blacksmiths, farmers, teachers. He sent them out to strategically secure resources and trade routes.
So what does this all mean? We need to look at how he actually managed this. He wasn't just planting farms, he was an infrastructure and economic visionary.
Very much so.
He built telegraph lines, he was one of the first to subscribe to Union Pacific stock, and physically connected Salt Lake City to the Transcontinental Railroad.
He was always looking ahead.
He even founded the institutions that became the University of Utah and Brigham Young University, specifically because he wanted to educate his people while keeping them insulated from what he called pernicious atheistic influences from the East.
And the mechanism of how he funded and managed all this is fascinating.
How did he pay for it all?
He instituted a massive shadow economy. Because hard currency was scarce, he utilized the church's tithing system. But tithing wasn't just giving 10% of your money.
What else was it?
It was giving 10% of your labor, your cattle, your crops. Young controlled this massive pool of resources.
Wow.
He established a gold mint using dust from the California gold rush to create his own currency. He processed lumber, grew sugar beets, ran ferry boat companies, and organized a mail service.
Wait, if he's using the church's tithing system to fund public works, where does the church's money end and his personal money begin?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because the sources say at the time of his death, he had a personal estate worth $600,000, which is roughly $18.1 million today.
Correct.
How does a religious leader justify dying with $18 million when his followers are literal pioneers scraping by in the dirt?
That was a huge point of contention, even back then. Young argued that he was taking on immense personal financial risk to build industries that benefited everyone.
Okay.
Because he essentially functioned as the city's operating system, where every major trade, land deal, and business venture was routed through his desk church assets, and his personal enterprises were deeply entangled. He argued his wealth was a byproduct of building a self-sustaining society that wouldn't have to rely on hostile outsiders.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Because while he is meticulously structuring this massive public territory, his private life required its own massive infrastructure.
That's putting it mildly.
Though Joseph Smith secretly introduced plural marriage to the church, Brigham Young really became the public father of Mormon polygamy. He ultimately married 56 women and fathered 57 children.
And when you look closely at the sources, the logistics and nuances of those 56 wives challenge our typical assumptions.
How so?
It wasn't just a simple harem. Of his 56 wives, 21 had never been married before, 17 were widows, and 6 were divorced.
Okay.
Crucially, researchers estimate that 31 of these marriages were what the church called eternity-only vows.
Okay, let's explain that. What does an eternity-only vow actually mean?
In their theology, marriages could be sealed not just for this life, but for eternity.
Right.
An eternity-only sealing meant the marriage did not involve conjugal relations during their mortal lives.
Oh, I see.
Sometimes he was acting as a proxy, being sealed to older women, or women whose previous husbands had died, to ensure they had a secure place in the afterlife hierarchy. And on the frontier, marrying a prominent leader like Young also provided widows with a critical social and economic safety net.
But even so, the daily logistics of housing and supporting the wives he did live with were staggering.
Absolutely staggering.
He literally had to build mansions just to house his family. He built the Lion House and the Beehive House right in downtown Salt Lake City.
Massive properties.
And it functioned like a small municipality. They had a private family store at the north end of the Beehive House where his wives and children had running accounting ledgers to buy what they needed for their individual households.
Yeah.
He wasn't just a husband, he was managing a domestic supply chain.
It really was its own microeconomy. But this level of absolute unchecked control over his family his church's economy, and the entire territory's politics, inevitably leads us to the most difficult chapters of his life.
Right, because when you build an empire in total isolation and you demand absolute obedience, any outside influence is viewed as a threat.
Exactly.
And that paranoia led to severe discriminatory policies and outright violence that deeply stained his legacy. Let's start by looking at his policies on race and slavery.
Young's views on slavery shifted dramatically as he consolidated power.
Did he start out pro-slavery?
Actually, no. In January 1852, he declared in a speech that no property can or should be recognized as existing in slaves.
Okay.
Yet just 2 weeks later, he completely reversed course, declaring himself a firm believer in slavery. He then led legislative efforts to formally legalize and regulate slavery in Utah through the 1852 Act in relation to service.
He also instituted a strict church ban that forbade black men of African descent from attaining the priesthood or participating in temple rites,
Yes.
which was a stark departure from Joseph Smith's leadership, where a few black men had actually been ordained to the priesthood. And the way Young justified this is crucial to understand. He utilized the curse of Ham interpretation from the Bible.
Yes, and to explain that logic, however flawed it was, the curse of Ham was a common 19th century theological justification used by many pro-slavery advocates.
Right, it wasn't just him.
No, it was widespread. It claimed that people of African descent were cursed by God through the biblical lineage of Noah's son Ham and his son Canaan.
Okay.
Young weaponized this theology to codify his personal prejudices into official church doctrine, arguing that black people could not hold authority.
And to show how deeply entrenched his administrative power was, that ban remained firmly in place until 1978.
1978, it's astonishing.
It shows how a single leader with absolute authority can lock an entire community into a prejudiced worldview for over a century.
Yes, it really does.
And this culture of absolute fearful obedience only intensified in the late 1850s during a period known as the Mormon Reformation.
The Mormon Reformation was an intense, fiery spiritual reawakening led by Young and his counselors.
Why did they start it?
They felt the people had grown complacent, and they wanted to aggressively purge sin from the territory. During this time, they preached some highly radical doctrines, most notably the concept of blood atonement.
How exactly did blood atonement work?
Young preached that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was not enough to redeem a person from certain grave, eternal sins.
Like what kind of sins?
Things like apostasy, meaning abandoning the faith, or adultery. He taught that the only way a sinner could partially atone for these specific sins was if their own blood was physically shed upon the ground as an offering.
That is intense.
Now, the modern church later formally repudiated this doctrine, and historians largely agree it wasn't practiced as an organized institutional form of capital punishment.
Right.
However, the rhetoric itself was incredibly violent, terrifying, and created a hyper-zealous atmosphere.
Which bridges the psychological gap to what happens in 1857.
Yes, it does.
Because of his absolute control and defiance of federal laws, the U.S. government decides they've had enough. President James Buchanan sends 2,500 federal troops toward Utah to install a non-Mormon governor.
The Utah War.
Brigham Young's reaction is total apocalyptic defense. He declares martial law, activates his militia, and the entire territory becomes a paranoid powder keg.
And in September of 1857, that powder keg explodes in one of the darkest days in Western history, the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Walk us through what happened.
A wagon train of immigrants from Arkansas, known as the Fancher Party, is passing through southern Utah on their way to California. Local Mormon militia members, along with some Native Americans they recruited, lay siege to the wagon train.
Oh, man.
Under a false flag of truce, they convince the immigrants to surrender their weapons, and then they slaughter at least 120 men, women, and children. They only spared children under the age of 7, believing they were too young to remember or testify.
This is horrific. And the historical debate around Brigham Young's direct involvement is intense.
Very intense.
The sources tell us that Young received a writer at his office in Salt Lake City, warning him about the contemplated attack. He sent a letter back directing the militia to let the wagon train pass unmolested.
Okay.
But the letter reportedly arrived on September 13, 2 days after the massacre had already happened.
But here is the chilling postscript that complicates his defense. When the U.S. Army later arrived in Utah, they erected a memorial cross at the site of the unburied bodies with a biblical engraving. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay."
Okay.
According to the journal of an apostle who was traveling with him, when Brigham Young visited the massacre site a few years later in 1861, He read the monument and suggested it should instead read, "Vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little."
Whoa.
Soon after, the monument was torn down by his entourage.
That is just incredibly heavy, and it forces the critical question.
Yeah.
How do historians separate a leader's direct orders from the actions of a highly agitated, militarized following?
It's the central debate.
Even if his letter telling them to stand down arrived 2 days too late, didn't his fiery rhetoric on blood atonement, his declaration of martial law, and his culture of absolute obedience create the exact conditions for the Mountain Meadows Massacre?
That is precisely what historians grapple with. Even if his hand didn't strike the match, he undoubtedly built the powder keg.
Right.
He created an isolated, fiercely loyal theocracy that viewed outsiders as literal existential threats. Because they'd been chased out of Missouri under an extermination order and chased out of Illinois after your founder was murdered, Young conditioned his followers to believe they were at war.
That makes sense.
The culture of obedience he fostered meant that local leaders felt completely justified in committing an atrocity because they believed it protected the community and aligned with Young's violent rhetoric.
It leaves a deeply complicated, heavy legacy that the American West is still grappling with today. Brigham Young died in August 1877 in Salt Lake City, likely from peritonitis caused by a ruptured appendix.
And right up to the end, his life was defined by the man who set him on his path 40 years earlier.
Joseph Smith.
Yeah. As he was lying in his bed dying, his final words were, "Joseph, Joseph," calling out to Joseph Smith.
He left behind a staggering biological and geographical footprint. Just 25 years after his death, a New York Times article estimated his direct descendants numbered over 1,000.
Over 1,000.
And by 2016, that number was estimated at around 30,000 living descendants.
It's wild. And if we connect all this back to the bigger picture, it leaves you with something profound to ponder.
What's that?
Consider how the American West would look today if the Latter-day Saints had just assimilated into Illinois, or if they had scattered into different factions after Joseph Smith's assassination.
It would be completely different.
Completely. Brigham Young's iron will not only saved his church from total collapse, but it fundamentally redrew the map of the United States. He built an intricate economy, hundreds of cities, and a lasting infrastructure in an environment that was incredibly hostile.
Right.
It forces us to ask a very difficult historical question. In the making of history, is sheer, ruthless administrative genius sometimes more powerful and more lasting than prophetic charisma?
That is a fascinating thought. The visionary founder dreams the dream, but it's the carpenter who actually cuts the wood and builds the house.
Beautifully said.
And in this case, he built an empire that couldn't be ignored. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring these sources for yourself because, as we saw today, the distance between an uneducated craftsman desiring the grave and the American Moses ruling a theocracy is filled with mechanisms of power that we are still trying to understand.